Hey everyone, it's Carbon here. I just want to start this guide first by saying that if this guide sounds a little weird, I'm sorry about that, but the room that I normally record in is currently being remodeled, and that leaves me with the living room. So if there's a bit of sound weirdness going on here, you can chalk it up to that. And without further ado, let's talk about Abra. And to start, the psychic type itself is weird. It's not as simple to define as many of the elemental types like fire or water. As its name implies, it's a type that is deeply tied to the mental energy of the Pokemon itself and the creatures and people around it. This leads to every single one of them being able to manipulate those energies to attack and defend themselves and to manipulate their environment. Think of moves like Confusion, Hypnosis, and Light Screen. As well, this ability to interact with and manipulate the mental energy of the world often, but not always, leads to them having immense mental faculties. Meaning they're usually pretty freaking smart. Like, a lot of them have human-level intelligence just in a Pokemon. And one of the best examples of this is the kind of power that's in the Abra line. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Pokemon Care Guides, where we go through how you would raise and keep different Pokemon lines in your own home. Today, we'll be talking about the psychic powerhouse Pokemon Abra and its evolutions Kadabra and Alakazam. Abra is a 3-foot tall, 43-pound Pokemon that has an interesting body shape. It has a primarily yellow body with a brown chest and thick, round tail. Its hands and feet each have 3 digits on them, and are both hooked like claws. Weirdly enough, though I think that it's a mammal, its body seems to have segmented armor across it that looks a lot like the carapace of a bug-type Pokemon. And the last thing to mention about Abra is that it actually spends the majority of its time asleep. It uses its immense psychic abilities to levitate itself, and to sense danger coming while it's sleeping. And then it teleports itself away with those same psychic abilities, just in case you needed more confirmation of its impressive mental abilities. Upon evolving into a Kadabra, it keeps the same general body shape with the segmented armor, the yellow and brown color scheme, and the fox-shaped head. Now though, it has a large bushy tail, a mustache, and a symbol of 3 wavy lines on its abdomen. It now also stands at 4 foot 3 inches tall, and weighs an average of 125 pounds. Oh, and it's now fully awake, and they tend to get their hands on a spoon as they strangely use them to amplify their abilities. Now, most Kadabra will actually remain that way their entire lives, as Alakazam is actually another trait evolution, meaning they need to experience a sharp electrical shock to their system for it to happen. Alakazam keeps the same overall body shape as its previous evolutions, with the chitinous yellow and brown armor. Really, the only major difference from Kadabra are its height, now standing around 5 feet tall, its weight, averaging around 105 pounds, and the fact that the facial hair grows much longer, becoming a sort of mustache, while this Pokemon also loses its tail. Oh, and the fact that their psychic abilities are massively increased. Like, to the point where it's routinely stated that they're smarter than humans. Which is gonna make caring for it very interesting. So, let's just dive straight into the guide and figure out if these Pokemon from this line are the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. Funny enough, the fact that these Pokemon are so smart actually makes the enclosure for them very easy. You should just treat them like a person. They're about the same size and eventually will match or even eclipse you in brain power, so it just makes sense to treat them that way. Honestly, the best thing to do for them is to keep them in your house, meaning that you will end up having to devote an entire room to these Pokemon, as keeping them in anything less would really just be mistreatment with how smart they are. Or, if you don't want to do that, then you could get them their own building that's separate from your house, almost like a shed that we always use. But they'll need something of higher quality than just a shed. Like those tiny houses that you can buy and have delivered online. That would be perfect for them. Either way, the best enclosure for these Pokemon is going to be along those lines. As for any decorations and additions that you'll need a feeding dish for Abra, as they tend to munch throughout the day thanks to their psychic napping. Kadabra and Alakazam, well, it might be a bit weird, but you'll either need to get them their own table to give them their meals on, or you can simply feed them at your table alongside yourself. I'm telling you, after Abra, these Pokemon go from being pets that you can take care of, to pretty much roommates that can only communicate with their brains. It's weird to make a guide about, but that's really just the facts. Anyway, Abra will also need a water dish that it can drink from. The later evolutions, well, they can either bring water to their mouths using their psychic abilities, or they can be taught how to use a glass much like a human. They'll also need a place to sleep, so a comfy single twin bed should do the trick. And last but not least, they will need some form of mental stimulation. Pokemon like this, their minds are their most important body part, and the mind needs to be worked just like any other muscle. So you're going to be looking for things like puzzles, object manipulation tests that they can use their psychic abilities for, solid, tangible things that they can interact with and test their psychic abilities on. Things like crossword puzzles and complex logic and math problems won't work for them as, while they are smart, they are still Pokemon. Math and a human language mean nothing to them, no matter how smart they are. To a Pokemon that can communicate its wants and feelings with a simple thought, language is simply a step back. So again, to keep your Pokemon stimulated, you'll be looking for real, physical objects that they'll have to think about and use their abilities on to manipulate. The last part of this surprisingly short enclosure section is going to be any other Pokemon that can be housed with them. Really, it's going to depend on the other Pokemon. Thanks to the massive intelligence that these Pokemon display, they can really get along with and recognize any Pokemon as a companion. So you're going to look at the other Pokemon to see if things will work out. That means that you shouldn't get anything that's too aggressive or territorial or will try to attack the other Pokemon. This will just cause your Abra to teleport away, and your Kadabra and Alakazam will psychically slam the other Pokemon into a wall. Speaking of which, remember, you'll be either keeping these Pokemon in your home, or you'll be keeping them in their own home. So any Pokemon that gets housed with them should be appropriate for that situation. But, aside from that, the only hard no that I would say being housed with these Pokemon would be any Ghost or Dark types. Those two types both give off a type of energy that negatively impacts Psychic types. But, aside from that one caveat, it really is dependent on what you're willing to raise and what you think your Abra line Pokemon will be willing to put up with. Availability. So, these Pokemon are in a weird place when it comes to availability. Abra itself isn't all that hard to find. Sure, it's not the most common Pokemon out there, but in the places that it does appear in the wild, you should be able to find one after just a bit of work. There are places like Granite Cave in Hoenn, routes 203 and 215 in Sinnoh, and plenty of places all over the Kanto region. Your biggest issue is going to be actually catching it. We'll talk about this again in the care section, but Abra itself actually has a built-in defense mechanism where if it senses any kind of unfamiliar irregularity in its environment, or anything dangerous coming towards it, it will teleport away. You need to be very lucky and very stealthy to get a hold of one, and oftentimes even that isn't enough. It's really the lucky person who's able to catch a wild Abra. As for Kadabra, they can be found a bit less common than Abra, but they still aren't that hard to find. And catching them is a lot easier as they won't just teleport away from you the moment they sense you, so you might actually have a chance with them. And lastly, with Alakazam, you aren't really gonna find them in the wild too often. It's the same issue with the polytoad evolution. Sure, the right conditions needed for this kind of evolution could happen in the wild if a Kadabra gets exposed to exactly the correct form of electrical stimulation, but it's almost unheard of. Realistically, the only place that you're going to get an Alakazam is trading a Kadabra with another trainer. Speaking of other trainers, the breeder scene for these Pokemon is decent, but not the most robust out there. Due to the intelligence of these Pokemon, raising and caring for them is fairly easy. But that same intelligence often makes breeders, myself included, feel slightly uncomfortable breeding and selling them to people. There are people out there that will do so, but it's treated much differently than what I do. So just be prepared that when you go to get one, it won't just be a simple purchase online or a trade through a machine. You'll most likely have to go to the breeder, meet the Pokemon, and see if the Pokemon themselves will choose you just as much as you choose them. And as for what a breeder will have available for you to pick from, they should have plenty of Abra and Kadabra available, and if you want an Alakazam right away, then getting one from someone who's selling Kadabra should be a piece of cake. Care. This is going to be the section that's going to be the strangest. Thanks to the intelligence of these Pokemon, you're almost going to be treating them like a needy roommate, like I said in the enclosure section. So this isn't going to be about you doing things for your Pokemon so much as it's going to be about setting them into patterns when they're young and reinforcing those patterns as they get older and mature. So step 1 is making sure that these Pokemon are comfortable around you, especially Abra. Because if you startle them, or they're just not used to human beings being around them, then they'll teleport away and you'll have no idea where they are. Getting a breeder-raised one is very helpful with this as they're born around people and become used to the human presence. They may still be nervous around you as you are a new person and they are in a new environment, but they won't just leave immediately. If you do get one from the wild, then you'll have to put in a bit of work to get these Pokemon to trust you. The best setup I've found for this is to have a Pokemon that can keep the Abra from teleporting. Whether it's one that has an ability like Arena Trap or Shadow Tag, or if it's one that knows the move Mean Look. Each of these will give you a window where you'll be able to work with the Pokemon and gain its trust. Without these kinds of restrictions on your Abra's ability to teleport away, you won't even get a chance to try building a bond with your Pokemon. When not in these training sessions, you'll want to keep the Abra in its Pokeball. That will allow it to have a safe space for it to sleep in without you worrying that it'll just up and vanish on you because it got spooked. Now, as for what you're going to be doing to gain its trust, you'll start with slowly approaching it while making yourself as non-threatening as possible. Get low to the ground, speak to it softly in a calm, reassuring tone, using calming words. Try to keep the idea in your mind that you're a friend and you aren't there to cause harm. Remember, these are strong psychic-type Pokemon, so they will pick up on your thoughts and your emotions. As well, that ability to look into your mind and understand your thoughts and intentions will greatly expedite this process, as the Abra will understand from your mind that you really don't mean it any harm and you're just trying to build a bond with it. Very quickly, this Pokemon will allow you to begin getting closer and closer. The time frame varies per individual on this, but it should be a fairly quick process. Food will also help, as in the beginning you'll also be feeding your Pokemon during these trust-building sessions. As well, you'll want to do these sessions in the room that the Pokemon is going to be using as its own space. This way, the Pokemon can get not only used to you, but also used to this being its home and a safe space for it to live in and return to if it does end up teleporting away. Eventually, as the sessions continue, you'll start to notice that your Abra is becoming more friendly and more used to you being there. They'll stop shying away from you and eventually let you get close enough to touch and interact with it, culminating in eventually your Pokemon approaching you instead of the other way around. When you reach that point, then I think it's safe enough to say that you don't need the other Pokemon around anymore to restrict your Abra's teleporting. At this point, if you've been doing as I said and having these trust-building sessions in the room where the Pokemon will be living in, then it should consider this place its home and feel safe there. After that, it's just a matter of setting up the routines that the Pokemon will follow for the rest of its life. Things like where and when it will be getting food, whether you will train it to use your bathroom or to go outside, when and where is the appropriate time to use its psychic abilities, and when it's not. It's going to be a lot of repetition, a lot of rewards for good behavior, and just keeping a positive and happy mindset, as that will really go a long way to helping establish these routines in your Pokemon's mind as a good thing. And again, between these Pokemon being just so intelligent and being able to look into your mind to try and understand what you want from them, they tend to learn these kinds of things pretty quickly. And as they evolve into a Kadabra and possibly even an Alakazam if you want, these patterns will remain with them and you should not have any problems with them even as they get smarter and smarter. Food will thankfully be relatively simple. What you're going to be looking for are a variety of foods that are good for brain development, ranging from leafy greens to a mix of berries and even a little bit of fish. I couldn't find any hard numbers for amounts that you should be feeding them per meal. However, I was able to find that per day, you should be giving your Abra roughly 1100 calories. This should be spread out over the day roughly, as Abra, thanks to its sleeping schedule, doesn't have a normal time to eat. They'll usually just realize that their body is hungry at random points throughout the day and use their psychic abilities to fetch themselves food. So instead of meals for Abra, what you're going to be doing is taking that food dish I mentioned earlier and you're just going to keep it stocked with small amounts of these kinds of food. That way, when your Abra does eventually get hungry, it can just pick and nibble at what it needs. And then just occasionally throughout the day, check on it, see if it needs some more food, make sure it's not running empty, and make sure the stuff that's there isn't going bad, especially the fish, as that can go bad pretty quickly. When they evolve into a Kadabra, you should increase the amount of food they get to 1,350 calories, and you should also swap them over from the nibbling open tray to a more regimented 2 meals a day, as now Kadabra is more awake and is more able to recognize and regulate its own feeding schedule. And then, if you do decide to go through with the evolution into an Alakazam, you'll be increasing the amount of food again to 1,500 calories per day. Keep in mind that these numbers could shift and change based on your Pokemon's actual weight and height, but roughly these calorie amounts are good for the average specimen and should give you a good starting point when it comes to how much you should be feeding them every day. Now, this last bit of the care section is really going to be a few smaller details that are involved with caring for these guys. Abra is meant to sleep most of the day. In fact, the average amount that they'll sleep is around 18 hours a day. They need this to ensure that they'll keep control over their psychic abilities, which are crucial to its mental development. Now, this isn't to say that they're helpless during this time. Thanks to their abilities, they are still fully aware of their surroundings and can even fight, flee, and eat while sleeping. My main point here is don't be worried that your Abra is going to become unhealthy because it always seems to be sleeping. That is a very much healthy and normal thing for these Pokemon to do. When talking about Kadabra and Alakazam, you often see them pictured with spoons or spoon-like objects in their hands. Strangely enough, they're able to use these objects to focus and magnify their psychic powers. How or why this works, I have no idea. But it does, and the Pokemon know this. Hence why they always either have or are looking for a spoon. So when your Abra evolves, just give it one. Any old silverware spoon will do. It does have to be metal, so no plastic spoons, but you can get a pack of those for less than $10. It's not too much to ask that you provide your Pokemon with one of them. But strangely enough, when it comes to Alakazam, they can actually do something incredible. They form their 2 spoons out of their own psychic energy. Yeah, they just make spoons from thin air, which simply blows my mind. So if you really don't want to give away any spoons to your Pokemon, then you don't have to for Alakazam. Though, a really cute touch is that if you give your Kadabra a spoon when they're young, and they keep it when you evolve them into an Alakazam, they'll still use it, and just make one spoon out of Psychic Energy. I just think that it's really cute that they'll keep it as a keepsake even though they don't need a physical spoon. And the last thing that you'll need to be able to care for these Pokemon effectively is that they will need some form of mental stimulation. Just like how you have to take most fighting types to a gym to stimulate their bodies, you'll have to figure out ways to stimulate these Pokemon's mind. When they're Abras and maybe young Kadabras, simple things like puzzles and memory games can be used. Older Kadabras will have more mental development, so they'll need things more along the lines of complex physical logic puzzles. You know, like the wooden blocks that need to be taken apart but they seem stuck together, or a puzzle box that needs to be solved to open it. And honestly, for Alakazam, it's so smart that you may just have to ditch the puzzles and physical interactable objects completely, and exchange them for doing different mental exercises with their psychic abilities. It'll almost be like a workout routine where you come up with things that will challenge your Alakazam's control over their abilities and make them have to work to complete it. These are things like juggling a certain number of objects, using their mental abilities to finish a puzzle, and separating a pile of salt and pepper. Things like this will force your Pokemon to really focus and will slowly work their mind so they can get stronger and stronger in using their abilities. You can find plenty of lists and ideas online for things to have your Pokemon to do, so don't worry if you can't come up with anything for that day or at all. Cost. Abra itself will probably start in the lower end of the high category, and the line will go up from there with Kadabra and Alakazam. That's mostly because all of the trust building that you have to do with the young Abra, and the fact that you often need another kind of Pokemon just to give you those bonding times. Add in the fact that they require so much space, and you can see why they can be so expensive. Luckily, once the Abra trust you, they're very easy to get along with and train, and you can house multiples of them together, which is a slight mitigating factor when it comes to the price. Speaking of the space, these Pokemon are going to be in the moderate category, even if you house them in your own home. Mostly because of all the decorations and mental stimulation games that you'll have to get them. But it will be more expensive if you decide to house them in their own building, so probably best to go with the house method instead. Food will be in the moderate category per month as well, and it's mostly due to the fish. If it were just the greens or the berries, then I would say this would be in the low category. But as we all know, meat is expensive. Thankfully, they don't eat much of it, and the extra that you have can just be frozen. Combine that with buying in bulk wherever you can, and it'll help to keep this cost lower. Conclusion. I don't know, psychic type Pokemon like this that are super smart, I always feel iffy about them. On the one hand, they are still a Pokemon, and while they might be smarter than a human, intelligence doesn't always equate to understanding or wisdom, and they very much still act like Pokemon in the wild. But on the other hand, you really can't treat them as a pet. They are way too smart for that. So it leads to this strange roommate-esque, parent-esque relationship between you and the Pokemon. And I've never really been a fan of having those kinds of relationships. But you might disagree. After all, these Pokemon are generally very well-tempered, pretty simple to care for if you're willing to put in the work on the trust, and can make very engaging Pokemon to have. So if everything I've said in this guide seems like a good deal to you, then the Abra line might just be the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Thank you all for listening, and please join us again next time when we go over the physical counterpart to this line, Machop, and its evolutions. Have a wonderful night, everyone. A lot of Pokemon types require you to have some sort of lifestyle in place for you to really mesh with them. If you want to get an ice type, then you should at least enjoy the cold at least a little bit. If you're going to get a fire or poison type, you should be very safety minded, because those types can be very dangerous to humans just by existing in the same place. And the same goes for those that are looking to have a fighting type Pokemon. Excluding those that are dangerous to be around, like the Mankey line that we've already covered, you're going to have to be a very, very active person to effectively mesh with one of these Pokemon. And the Machop line is a perfect example of that. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Pokemon Care Guides, where we go through how you would raise and care for different Pokemon lines in your own home. Today, we'll be talking about Machop and its evolutions Machoke and Machamp. Machop itself is mainly humanoid, with 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head. However, it has bluish-gray skin, along with a vaguely reptilian head and a short tail. Its eyes are large with red irises, and the top of its head is decorated with 3 parallel crests. Despite the fact that this Pokemon's body is pretty much nothing but super compact and strong muscle, they only stand about 2.5 feet tall and weigh only 43 pounds on average. However, that does change when they evolve into a Machoke. Machoke now stand about 5 feet tall, and all the new muscle means that it weighs around 155 pounds on average. It keeps the same basic reptile humanoid body style, but its muscles have greatly expanded, now actually looking like someone who spends most of their time at the gym. Their skin has changed into a darker hue than they had in their previous evolution, and along with their arms are 2 sets of 3 red striations, almost looking like bulging veins. And lastly, they develop a strange black pattern around their waist and upper thighs that looks very much like a pair of short workout shorts. Yeah, that's actually not clothing, that's a pattern on the Pokemon's skin. The belts, however, that both Machoke and Machamp wear are not. Those are actually of human make and design, but we'll get into that when we get to the care section, as there's a bit to explain there. And last in the evolutionary line is Machamp, who's famous for his signature 4 arms. That's right, to make itself a better fighter, Machamp has evolved another set of arms that grow out of its shoulders, allowing it to become much more powerful. Aside from that, its skin tone goes back to what it had as a Machop, and its face loses some of the more reptilian aspects that Machoke had. Those extra limbs, while they do add quite a bit more weight, Machamp weighing at around 286.5 pounds, they really don't get counted in its new height since they're arms. After all, you don't get taller just because you raise your hand. So the average Machamp only stands around 5 foot 2 inches, which immediately feels weird that the majority of human adults are taller than this incredible fighting Pokemon. But don't let its height fool you. They contain a lot of power in those muscles, and it will take a lot of work on your end to make sure they stay that way. So let's get into the guide and figure out if these are the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. This is going to be another case where you could decide to house your Pokemon in a separate area from yourself, like in its own space out in your yard, or you could give it its own space in your home. However, I think that with these Pokemon, it's much better to house them separate from yourself, as they tend to be very active Pokemon, and unless you're very much into the same thing, it can become very disruptive to normal everyday life to have a Pokemon that's constantly working out in your home. So instead, we're going to build this Pokemon its own enclosure, so that it can do its own thing without interrupting your life too much, while still allowing you to interact with these Pokemon on a regular basis. When it comes to their living space, it's not too dissimilar from a human. They'll enjoy as much space as you give them, but the minimum amount for just one of these Pokemon is 150 square feet. This means that you could have any dimensions you want, as long as they don't get below 7 feet on a side, and the area that the housing takes up is no less than that 150 square feet. Some of you may think that that may be a bit too small, but these are very active Pokemon that'll only really spend time inside if they're sleeping, eating, or escaping bad weather. The rest of the time, they'll be outside being active. Now, that doesn't mean that their living space can be just open to the elements. Once again, we're going to be looking at a shed-like structure. Then, inside of the structure, you want to provide things like a twin mattress that they can sleep on, and a table that they can eat at, along with a source of water and a bowl or plate that they can eat out of. And that's really all they need for their internal space. When I say that these are outdoor Pokemon, I really mean it. On that note, let's move to the outside of their enclosure. These Pokemon's entire thing is how they love to work out, and more specifically, they love to lift weights and fight. And this exercise passion is a big part of their healthy development. Their bodies and muscles are meant to be pushed to their limits, and if they aren't able to do so, then they can start to diminish physically. So you need to provide them with weights, otherwise they will just start finding random things that they can use to work out, which will end up being things like your lawnmower, your car, or even your neighbor. But thankfully, you don't have to get the expensive gym equipment that you often see at human gyms. In fact, it might be best to avoid that kind of thing, as your Pokemon won't understand how to use it right away, and they're either going to end up breaking it, not using it, or you'll have to spend time teaching them how to use it when they have an instinctual understanding of how to just use some heavy items. So instead, you're going to get them two kinds of weights. The first is that you'll get them a rack of dumbbells that are specifically rated for fighting type Pokemon like the Machop line. They come in weights that are just way heavier than any human set would ever be. Thankfully, dumbbells and weights like that are very easy to understand and very hard to break, so they should be able to understand how to use them. These can be stored inside the Pokemon's home. That way, even in inclement weather, they'll still be able to get their workout in. And then, the second thing that you're going to get are big rocks. Ones that range from about 100 pounds for a Machop to thousands of pounds for Machamp. I know this may seem weird, just giving your Pokemon rocks, but you need to remember a few things. One is that these Pokemon have an instinctual understanding of how to effectively work out. Sure, they may get a few things wrong, but for the most part, they know how to test their strength, and how to work on getting stronger. And when in the wild, what they use to do this are massive rocks. And Pokemon battles, but we'll cover that in the care section. So just the very act of providing them with these large rocks means that they'll use them to get good workouts in, no input from you required. Lastly, when looking at the Pokemon that you can house with them, you'll have to look for something that'll get along with the routine that your Machop evolution is going to have. So nothing that's going to be super territorial, or get annoyed with the constant working out that your Pokemon is going to be doing. You're also going to want to make sure that any Pokemon you house with them will be tough and sturdy, because these Pokemon love to fight. Any opponent that they can test their strength against is going to be a target, just like a Charizard. So while that may be great if you have another fighting type with them, it won't be great for most Pokemon. And it can also be pretty stressful on yourself to come out and find your Pokemon are battling each other. So I'd really say that the only Pokemon that you can safely house with them are going to be Pokemon like other Machop evolutions, or a lot of the other fighting types. That's unfortunately how it goes with a lot of these fighting types. Availability. The Machop line is not a common sight in the wild, mostly because they live in mountainous and cave environments, where people don't tend to go on a regular basis. We're looking at places such as Mount Moon in Kanto, the Fiery Path in Hoenn, 10 Carat Hill in Alola, most Victory Roads, places like that. However, once you get to one of those areas, then you shouldn't have any problems finding one of these Pokemon. In the area they live, they are a very common sight. Always remember though that these Pokemon love to fight, so you need to bring along your own Pokemon to make sure that these Pokemon don't try to fight you. The only regions where you won't find any of them are in the Paldea and the Unova regions. If you live in those regions, then I'm sorry, but you'll have to either travel to catch one of your own, or you'll have to go to a breeder. And I should say that while Machop and Machop are abundant in the wild, thanks to its status as a trait evolution, Machamp is very rare. They do happen, very rarely, but the odds of a wild Machop experiencing the exact needed electrical stimulation outside of a trade machine is astronomically low. Moving on to breeders, this is actually a common Pokemon to find in the breeding scene. Machop and its evolutions are very strong both in and out of battle. For trainers, they're one of the go-to fighting type lines, and have become very popular to the point that many fighting type gym leaders and Elite Four members have one of these Pokemon. And outside of battle, people use these Pokemon for workout partners, assisted living for those that have the trouble getting around, and even construction and moving companies use these Pokemon. The great strength of these Pokemon makes them highly valued in many different ways, and because of that widespread good value, many people raise and sell them. All of this is a long way to say that you should find a breeder for these guys pretty easy for all three of the evolutions. Care. Most of the care for these guys is going to revolve back to their muscles and working out. For example, you need to make sure that these guys have access to a good workout almost every day. If they're not able to push themselves and physically work their bodies every single day, then they will suffer not just physically, but also mentally, as working out is a big part of their psychology as well as their biology. They'll fall into a depression, they'll get frustrated, angry, and prone to lashing out. To that end, for anyone that gets these Pokemon, I highly recommend a Pokemon gym. No, not a league-sanctioned gym with the badges and the gym leader, though that can help. I mean just a regular Pokemon gym. These are places that are designed for Pokemon like the Machop line to go there and be able to work out and tire themselves out as much as they want. They're even able to have Pokemon battles there where professional trainers will have your Machop evolution test their abilities against other Pokemon that go there. It's honestly a really good idea for those of you that don't have much space for outside exercising, or even for those of you that do, because it's still a great place for your Pokemon to go. Before we move on to the rest of the care section, there is one thing that I have to mention to you. As we've already covered, these Pokemon are supernaturally strong. But the thing is, while still strong, many Machop or Machamp that you encounter will most likely have their power greatly restricted, thanks to those belts that they wear. See, despite the fact that any Machop or Machamp that has the belt on it is ridiculously strong, it's nothing compared to the true power of these Pokemon. The pure strength that is contained in their bodies is enough that there are old legends of the rare wild Machamps moving mountains, and swarms of Machop rearranging entire landscapes as they train with each other. And, as you can imagine, that's not great for any human that runs into them, or lives near them. So, governments from around the world pooled their resources together and were able to develop a belt that contains technology within it that restrains the strength of the wearer greatly. Then they put massive programs into place where top-tier professional trainers were employed all around the world to go out and catch as many of the Machop and the rare Machamps that they could, so they could be belted and then released back into the wild. And while it has scaled back in scope since the first wave of catching, this program is still in effect today, where trained people go out, catch any newly evolved Machops, and place a belt on them. And I'm sure there are some of you out there wondering, Well, wouldn't having their strength restrained be bad for the Pokemon if they're just released back into the wild? Not really. Thanks to their overwhelming strength, Machop and especially Machamp don't really have natural predators. On top of that, the Pokemon kinda took it as a challenge. To fight, work out, and live with this kind of handicap in place, they were kind of all about it. Experts say that they just see it as a harder challenge. The wild populations even started to seek people out that were putting belts on them so they could get one. That's why you will usually always see a wild Machop with belts. Alright, interesting history lesson, but what does that have to do with you? Well, again, due to the power that these Pokemon possess in their unrestrained bodies, all the governments around the world made it mandatory that if you own a Machop or a Machamp, then you are required to put a belt on them. This is a public safety thing, as an unrestrained one of these Pokemon could cause massive damage and bodily harm. If you have a Machop, then you need to make sure that you get a belt ready for when it evolves, and as soon as it does so, put that belt on it. This is for both your safety and to avoid the massive fine that you'll get if someone finds out that you haven't done so. And the belts are easy to get a hold of. The governments themselves sell them online for a very small amount, and they'll ship them to your house. So there's no reason that you shouldn't have a belt ready for your Machop when it evolves. Thankfully, this is really only a concern if you have a Machop that's ready to evolve. Any wild Machop that you catch should have the belt on it already if the government workers are doing their job. And any Machop or Machamp that you get from a breeder should have one on already. When it comes to food for these guys, they have a very specific dietary requirement. And I don't mean that they're carnivores or herbivores, I mean they need very specific macronutrients on a regular schedule to sustain their working out and bodybuilding. You see it all the time too with humans that are doing the same thing. And in all honesty, a Machop Pokemon's diet wouldn't be all that different from a human's diet would be if they were trying to achieve the same goal. And, of course, that means that a big part of their diet is going to be protein, and lean protein at that. Things like poultry, fish, and even some supplements and powders are a good source of protein for these guys. As well, you want to be careful with starchy foods. They can be great for energy, so they should be fed early in the mornings, and they can be good for muscle repair after a workout. Be careful though, as they can also play havoc on your Pokemon's health if they eat those starches and they're not worked off. As well, mixed in with this should be a moderate amount of fruits and veggies, to add in some variety to your Pokemon's diet, and also be sure that they're getting the right amount of nutrients from those things. As for the amount you should be feeding them, well, there are plenty of different diets online that would work for these guys, so you'll have to do some experimenting to see what your Pokemon likes and dislikes. Do not force them into one routine when it doesn't work for them. However, many of these routines had a couple of similarities that we'll go over. The first is that these Pokemon have massive calorie intakes to support that muscle mass. For example, Machop should be taking in a daily average of 2,500 calories, which may not seem like much to the average adult, but you have to remember that Machop is the size of a toddler, and it only goes up from there. Machop, being bigger and much more muscular, needs around 6,000 calories a day, which is triple the amount of food the average human should eat. And Machamp is the worst of all of them. With 2 extra limbs that are just as muscular as the rest of its body, in combination with being bigger than Machop, means that these Pokemon need an astounding 9,000 calories a day. It's quite frankly an enormous amount of food. As for when you're going to feed them, they're going to have the most meals of any Pokemon that we've talked about so far, having 5 meals a day instead of the normal 3. So you'll be feeding them breakfast, brunch, lunch, afternoon snack, and then dinner. And remember, not all of these meals will be the same. Breakfast and whatever meal your Pokemon finishes their workouts for the day around should have more carbs than the others. As well, dinner should probably have more fruits and veggies, so the fiber in those can keep your Pokemon feeling more satiated throughout the night. And every meal should have protein in it for muscle growth and repair. I know it's a lot to deal with and think about, and if you don't live this lifestyle already, then it can really end up being too much. That's why most of the people that have these Pokemon are either gym rats who spend most of their time working out alongside their Pokemon, or use them for manual labor for a company. Just the pure expansiveness of this diet can be a big barrier to entry on these Pokemon. Cost. I hate to say it, but there really won't be anything about this Pokemon line that's going to be cheap. Take the food for example. With the types of food that they need and the sheer amount of food that these Pokemon eat per day, you are easily looking at being in the very high category. Sure, you can try to lessen this by growing or raising your own food or buying in bulk, but that won't cause the category to change. It's gonna be a lot no matter what. And the enclosure won't be any better. Between the shed internals, the workout equipment, the heavy rocks, and the gym membership that you have to get for these guys, you are definitely looking at the high category, if not the very high category. This could go up or down depending on how often you need to replace things like the weights or the rocks. And don't expect to have a break for your bank account for the Pokemon either. Given how much goes into the care of just one of these Pokemon, breeders are not going to be giving these things away. Just the food alone will cause this price to go up. But the fact that you can house them together relatively easily, and the fact that there's a large market for them outside of battle thanks to their out-of-battle utility, do somewhat mitigate the final cost. In the end, you'll probably be looking at something around the high category for a Machop, and around the very high category for a Machoke and Machamp. Conclusion. These Pokemon really come with a lifestyle. The Machop line are really great Pokemon to interact with, but if you're going to be raising one, then you need to be in that fitness kind of lifestyle. These are not the Pokemon for someone who just wants to hang out on the couch after work and take it easy. They are constantly working out, constantly trying to improve their bodies, and if you aren't into that, then they can really be too much to handle. But if you do live your life like that, then these can make great workout buddies. And I've often heard that people say that their Machop evolution motivates them to keep going on their own workout journey. They also are just great Pokemon if you give them a job. Do you have someone that needs help getting around? Well, a Machoke or a Machamp would be great for that. Are you constantly dealing with heavy things that need to be moved and shifted? These Pokemon will just treat it like another workout. They are so versatile with what they can do, so long as it's physical work. So if you have that kind of mindset and drive to work out, or you have something that'll function as their job, then these could easily be the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Thank you all for listening, and please join us again next time when we cover the pitcher plant Pokemon Bellsprout and its evolutions Weepinbell and Victorybell. Have a wonderful night, everyone. One of the major benefits that many people think of when they think of grass-type Pokemon is the ease that you have when you feed them. After all, most of them, like the Oddish line that we've already covered in the series, are able to pull nutrients from the ground itself, thanks to their plant-like biology. Even those that are still more animal than plant can do this, as seen with Bulbasaur and its ability to partially sustain itself off sunlight. But what happens when the grass type circles right back around to being carnivorous again? Well, you end up with the Bellsprout line. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Pokemon Care Guides, where we go through how you would raise and care for different Pokemon lines in your own home. Today, we'll be talking about the Bellsprout line. Bellsprout itself stands at an average of 2 foot 4 inches and weighs about 9 pounds. They have a very thin stem-like body with 2 root-like legs, and 2 wide green leaves on either side where its arms should be. The head is bright yellow and shaped like an upside-down pitcher, where the opening of the pitcher is where Bellsprout's mouth is. This mouth is surrounded by a pink ring that I think serves the same function as lips, and it has 2 small beady eyes. Upon evolution, its entire body plan changes. Where before the pitcher was just its head, it's now its entire body, losing the semi-humanoid shape that it had before. Think of it as just a massive yellow head, with a large mouth on the bottom and a small brown stem on the top that it uses to hang from trees and other high up places. It still has the 2 green leaves on either side of its head, and the eyes have gotten larger, so now that you can see the sclera around the iris. A Weepinbell is slightly larger than its pre-evolution as well, now being 3 foot 3 inches and 14 pounds. And if you were to leave them be, that's where the evolution line would end. But once a Weepinbell is exposed to a Leaf Stone, they evolve once again into a Victreebel. As a Victreebel, they gain a massive increase in size, growing to be 5 foot 7 inches tall. However, they really don't weigh that much, only being 34 pounds on average, as most of their body consists of empty space thanks to their massive mouth. If you take Weepinbell's body shape and flip it upside down, you would generally get what Victreebel looks like. The mouth is now at the top of the Pokemon instead of the bottom. It has 2 sharp teeth inside it, and the eyes have moved upward to just underneath the mouth. The mouth also now has a leaf-like covering that the Pokemon can use to trap prey in its mouth, as well as a long vine-like tail that extends from the leaf covering. Its yellow body is now a mottled greenish brown. As you can tell from the unique shape of its body and the fact that past the first evolution they don't have any way to pull nutrients from the ground, this line looks like it's going to offer some interesting takes on caring for a grass-type Pokemon. So let's get into it and see if these Pokemon could be the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. Right away, we're looking at a fully enclosed enclosure. These are very tropical Pokemon. I mean, sure, they could deal with cooler climates if they have to, such as with the Johto or the Kanto regions, but it's not ideal for them. It can stunt their growth and stress them out a lot. Their best environments are jungles, places where the heat never really goes away and the humidity is always like walking through soup. That means that unless you live in a place like that, then you need to make that habitat for them. Thankfully, past the Bellsprout stage, they're very sedentary Pokemon, as they're ambush predators, meaning they tend to spend most of their day just hanging out and waiting for prey to come to them. So you aren't going to be looking at something the size of a Zubat or an Oddish enclosure. Instead, you'll need something that's at least 15 feet by 15 feet for Bellsprout and Weepinbell, and if you do plan on going all the way to a Victreebel, then you should increase the size of it to 25 by 25 feet. The roof for both of these sizes can be anywhere between 15 feet tall and up, and that's mostly to fit the decorations, which we'll cover in a bit. While they don't often move, you will need the space to make your Pokemon feel more comfortable and also provide them with enough environment to feel that they're hidden. As for the walls of the enclosure, this will be built almost exactly like a greenhouse. The walls and ceiling should be made out of an opaque glass or plastic, something that's clear enough that it'll allow the sunlight to come in, but clouded enough to prevent the full harshness of direct sun. This will also help to keep the internal temperature high, as these Pokemon thrive best at temperatures between 65 and 85 degrees. Honestly, not that bad, but it's the humidity that'll make it feel a lot hotter than it actually is. Bellsprout and its evolutions do best at humidity levels between 70 and 85%, which means that just stepping inside of this enclosure will mean you're going to start sweating. Tropical regions like this can be brutal if you aren't used to them. Now, speaking of the inside, the first thing you're going to need is a good layer of dirt, something that's at least 2 feet deep. You don't really have to worry about the nutrient content of the soil too much with these guys like you do with the Oddish line, as they get most of their nutrients from the insects and prey they consume. The only exception to this is Bellsprout, which will root its feet to get water. So for the soil, you're going to need a combination of things that'll hold water well without allowing too much excess water to sit in your enclosure. What you should have is a mixture of 30% perlite, which is a form of processed volcanic rock that is great at holding and draining excess water, and 70% sphagnum moss, which is also great at holding in water. This means that any water you add to your enclosure won't just drain away easily or evaporate away quickly in the high heat of the enclosure. Use this mixture to form the soil level of your enclosure. As for other decorations, you're going to want plenty of other foliage for your Pokemon to camouflage themselves in. They can be either real or fake, though if you get the real ones, then you need to make sure that they're able to live in the same environment that you're building for your Bellsprout evolution. You'll want some shrubs or bushes along the ground that your Bellsprout can hide in, as well as high up perches that your Weepinbell and Victreebel can hide in, like branches or different poles that they can hang from and are slightly obscured while they do so. You'll also need to provide them with some shade, as long exposure of direct sunlight can be bad for them long term. The best solution that I've found has been to get a few fake trees that you can place along the sides of the enclosure. They'll provide your Pokemon with plenty of vertical space that they need, while the leaves of the tree will provide all the shade they need as well. Just be sure to get ones that are able to fit inside the building, and to anchor them deep into the soil so they don't fall and hurt one of your Pokemon. And really, that's it for decorations. Sure, there are a few small things that you'll have to do, like get a sealed door that won't let moisture out when it's closed, or get a vent somewhere up near the top of your building that you can open if the humidity starts to get too high, but that's all maintenance stuff that you'll have to do for this enclosure that we'll cover later on in this care section. When talking about Pokemon that can be housed with these Pokemon, you need to be very careful. These Pokemon will try to make a meal out of anything that's smaller than they are. Anything that they think can fit inside their mouth means that they're going to try to eat it. And with Victreebel, they may still try to eat it even if it's too big. They have a habit of taking down large prey and then using their leaves to cut it into small, eatable chunks. So you need something that is tough enough to either withstand them or to make them not even think about trying to go after it. On top of that, you need to make sure that the other Pokemon won't go after your Bellsprout evolution in turn. Being mainly grass types, they can be prey to a lot of larger predators, though their poison typing does help to ward off some of the smaller ones. On top of that, you'll also have to think about if the other Pokemon is fit to live in the same environment as Bellsprout and its evolutions. After all, no ice type is going to be comfortable in those conditions. And between not needing to be prey to the Bellsprout line, not needing to prey on the Bellsprout line, and having to survive in a tropical environment, it might be tough to find something that'll be able to peacefully coexist with your Bellsprout evolution inside this enclosure. Well, aside from other Bellsprout line Pokemon. They tend to get along with each other fairly well, even to the point where it's been observed that Victreebel collect and store any leaf stones they find, so to give them to other Weepinbell. So, if nothing else, they can at least be housed with one another. And do always keep in mind that the enclosures that I describe in these guides are only designed to house one Pokemon. If you decide to get another one, then you will have to expand the enclosure accordingly. Availability. Surprisingly, despite the fact that the only really tropical region is Alola, they're actually more abundant in the Kanto region than anywhere else. I mean, they're almost on every route surrounding Saffron City, nearly the entire east coast of Kanto from Lavender Town to Fuchsia City, and even the few routes that are north of Celadon City have a good population of these Pokemon. And it's not just Kanto. As the Sprout Tower indicates, there are good amounts of Bellsprout around Violet City over in Johto. Now, that's not to say that they're everywhere. Hoenn, Unova, Galar, and mainland Paldea all don't have any Bellsprout populations, and the remaining regions may have some Bellsprout populations, but they're confined to only a few different routes. But as you can see, despite how good a tropical environment is for these Pokemon, they've been able to spread and thrive in all these different kinds of places. And thrive they do, as they are very common in areas where they live. If you are able to get to where they live, then you should have no problems finding a Bellsprout or even a Weepinbell. The one that you might have some trouble finding is a Victory Bell, as they need a Leaf Stone to get to that stage. But on the other hand, Leaf Stones are more common than any of the other elemental stones, so there is a higher chance of finding them in the wild than other stone evolutions. When it comes to breeders though, there's a moderate presence of these Pokemon in the breeding scene. As we'll get to, these Pokemon aren't that bad to take care of, and the fact that you can raise many of them together with no problems means that keeping and breeding large amounts of them can be very easy. But then again, needing to build an entire enclosure to house them can be a big impediment to many people trying to get into breeding these Pokemon. After all, why get Pokemon that need this specialized enclosure when you can instead get a grass Pokemon line that you can just keep outside, like the Oddish or the Cherubi lines? So, in the end, yeah, you'll be able to find someone who will be able to sell you one of these Pokemon, but you just may have to take some time to find them. Catchability. Yeah, you heard that right. I've decided to add a new category to the care guides from now on. The reason that I'm doing this is simple. My view on Pokemon has always been slightly skewed. I was raised on a farm where my parents raised and sold Pokemon. I moved to the Sinnoh region and set up my own farm where I raise and breed Pokemon. I've spent my entire life surrounded by this kind of life and never really saw the point in going out and catching my own Pokemon when there was someone out there that would sell me one of whatever I wanted. And I still hold that opinion to be true, but I recognize that a big part of interacting with Pokemon and many young people interacting with the world is by catching their own Pokemon. The first time you throw a Pokeball and catch a wild Pokemon can oftentimes become a treasured memory for many people. And there are many Pokemon species out there that are really only available to those that are willing to go out and catch them for themselves. To that end, I've decided to add into this part of the guide for those of you that want to know how easy it'll be to catch the Pokemon that the guide is about, as it's often information that I've just kind of lumped into the availability section, if I mention it at all. Which brings us back to the Bellsprout line. These Pokemon can be tricky to find and catch. Being ambush predators, they tend to lie in wait for prey to come to them, all while blending in with the surrounding environment. So, if you are going to go out hunting for one of these Pokemon, be sure to keep your Pokemon by your side at all times, and keep your eyes peeled. The worst thing that you could do when hunting for one of these Pokemon is to get surprise attacked. Thankfully, these aren't the most aggressive species that you can go looking for, and often, if they've just eaten anytime near when you pass them by, they'll leave you alone while they digest. A good hint that I've constantly seen online is to always look up. While Bellsprout tends to stay on the ground and can be the easiest of them all to find, the stronger two evolutions are very arboreal, sticking to staying up in the tree branches before striking at prey. In the end though, as long as you see them coming, then they shouldn't be too much of a threat. A good flying or fire type Pokemon will be able to protect you from them long enough for you to get them in a Pokeball. Once in the Pokeball, they don't seem to put up too much of a fight either, though that can change with the individual and the evolution stage they're in, with the latter stages of course being harder to catch and possibly needing more Pokeballs. In all, they can be anywhere from an easy to moderate challenge to catch. Care. A large part for caring for these Pokemon is going to be feeding. Normally, with a Pokemon that is as much plant as these guys are, you wouldn't really need to worry about feeding them. Pokemon like this tend to get most of their nutrition from the soil and the sun. But Bellsprout and its evolutions, despite being plant-based life, actually are carnivorous. They tend to feed on small bug Pokemon, as well as small mammals, small birds, really anything they think they can take down is a potential prey item. So you're going to need to feed them meat. Thankfully, they are still plant-based and do get some of their nutrition from the sun by using the broad leaves that all of them have. Combine that with the fact that they seldom move during the day when trying to attract prey, and you'll find that they don't really eat that much. For Bellsprout, a Cutie Fly or two twice a week or so should hold them over nicely. For Weepinbell and Victorybell, you'll want to upgrade that to a Caterpie once a week for Weepinbell and twice a week for Victorybell. Of course, the food should be frozen and then thawed out when you plan on feeding them to your Pokemon. I don't recommend live feeding ever because it can easily lead to your Pokemon being injured by the prey. How you feed them is rather easy though. First things first is that you need to locate where your Pokemon is in the enclosure. After all, they are most likely hiding among the foliage and decorations that you've provided. Once you find them, head inside the enclosure with the defrosted food, slowly approach your Pokemon, making sure to show that you mean no harm, but also showing that you know where they are and that you don't fear them. The latter part will help to reinforce the idea that you are not meant to be taken as prey. Once you get close enough, within roughly 10 feet or so, take the food and place it on the ground and walk away. After you leave and close up the enclosure, the Pokemon will come over and take the food. A nice side benefit to this is that over time, the Pokemon will start to see you as less interloper in their territory and more of a food provider and friend. It might never get to the point where they approach you for food, but after some time they should allow you to get close enough to touch them and feed them by hand, which is important when you get to the pruning that you'll have to do later. Though I will add that it's generally much easier to befriend a Bellsprout and Weepinbell than it is to befriend a Victorybell, due to their position in the food chain. Victorybell is much higher in the food chain and has less natural predators to fear, meaning that they are less inclined to work with other species. Bellsprout and Weepinbell, however, do have natural predators that they need to keep an eye out for. Combine that with the fact that they're oftentimes less powerful than a Victorybell, and you should have an easier time getting them to trust you. So before evolving your Weepinbell, you may want to work on building that trust between you and your Pokemon. That way, it's already established when they evolve. And, like I said, the best way to build that trust is with food. Now that we've talked about the food, I want to also mention the acid. The way that these Pokemon digest their food is that they have a very strong acid inside their mouths. This acid gives off a very sweet scent, which is then used to draw prey within striking distance. The reason that I bring this up is because that acid is very strong, as I've already said. It usually has a pH between 2 and 3, meaning that if it comes into contact with your skin, it can cause some severe burns. This shouldn't be too much of an issue. After all, to come into contact with the acid, you would have to be inside the Pokemon's mouth. And at that point, I'm guessing you have other things to worry about. But to be on the safe side, always be sure to have both a neutralizing agent nearby that you can use to get rid of the acid on your skin, as well as a burn kit to treat any injuries that you received. It's always better to be prepared for the unlikely scenario, that way you aren't unprepared when that scenario does eventually happen.
Let's bring that trust we mentioned before back into the picture now. Once you've managed to build up enough trust with these Pokemon that they allow you to touch and interact with them, that's when the pruning will start. It's nothing major, but as all of these Pokemon grow, the leaves on their sides and the vine on your Victory Bell will need pruning. You'll see that a small bud of a new leaf will begin to appear at the base of the old one, while at the same time the older and bigger leaf will start to brown and wither at the edges. It's nothing to worry about, but do keep an eye on it. Once the new leaf gets big enough, it should force the old leaf to detach and fall to the ground, replacing it. However, sometimes the old leaf can get stuck. If it remains there, attached to the Pokemon, then it can cause some health problems by impeding the growth of the new leaf and causing sickness to set in as the old leaf begins to rot. A good idea for this is that once the old leaf has become mostly brown, begin to tug on it. Gently, not too hard. If the leaf is ready to come off, then it should just pull right off the Pokemon's body with no issue. If it doesn't, then wait a few more days and try again. The health of your Pokemon shouldn't be a concern until the leaf has turned completely brown. If at that point the leaf still refuses to come off, then you may want to take your Pokemon to the Pokemon Center. That way a registered nurse can take a look at them and see if there's a deeper problem going on. The last thing that we should talk about care-wise for these Pokemon is regarding the water. Be sure to never let the enclosure dry out. The ground should always be moist, the air should always be humid, and there should always be water supplied for the Pokemon to drink from. This is important as the water helps them produce the acid that they use to eat, and if that acid dries out, it can be a major health risk to the Pokemon itself. The only issue is that they can't drink from a bowl or anything similar, as they don't have a tongue or a throat or anything near a normal digestive system. The way that they get fluid in the wild is through their food and through rainwater. So you have two options. One is that you can install a sprinkler system in the enclosure that'll water them enough that the Pokemon and the environment doesn't dry out. Or you can decide to make sure they get enough water through their food, whether that be by having the food itself be very wet, or by injecting water into their food to create a pocket of water inside of it. I would generally go with the second method, as it comes to be less expensive and easier in my opinion. But the sprinkler system does mean that you don't really have to worry about remembering to give your Pokemon their water, and it does tend to take care of the entire enclosure at the same time. Cost. Food won't be that much. With the little amount that these Pokemon eat per month, you shouldn't be in more than the low category for Bellsprout and the moderate category for Weepinbell and Victory Bell. And the plus side is that you can order their food in bulk, freeze whatever you aren't using at the moment, and it should keep for way longer. This means that not only could you get a bulk discount from wherever you're buying it from, but that you won't have to worry about getting more food for some time. The Pokemon itself will cost more than the food to get, mostly because there aren't an abundance of people that are raising and selling these Pokemon. A lot of people are weirded out by having to feed bugs to their plants. After all, the main reason that many people go for grass-type Pokemon is because a lot of their feeding methods are nice, easy, and don't involve meat. But, that being said, there still is a niche market out there for these Pokemon, which helps to balance out the price somewhat. You're probably looking at the moderate category for the first two evolutions, but that might jump up to the high category for a Victory Bell simply for the price of the stone that the breeder will have to buy. And lastly, the enclosure is going to put you in the very high category. It won't be as expensive as building something like the Poliwag's enclosure, or thank Arceus, the Zubat enclosure, but you are still going to have to build a fully encapsulated enclosure that can sustain high humidity and high temperatures. This, unfortunately, means that you're staring down the barrel of an investment in the very high category. Conclusion. Personally, I like the Bellsprout line. They're very unique looking Pokemon with the big yellow bodies that function as mostly mounts. They're also the rare Pokemon line that starts bipedal and loses that as they evolve. And for me, I think I'd enjoy the act of raising them and keeping them. But that's not to say they're for everyone. The ambush predator style of these Pokemon, along with the presence of the acid, could prove a hard challenge to a newbie that hasn't raised many Pokemon before. I would say that these are more intermediate Pokemon, good for someone who has gotten used to taking care of the easier to raise Pokemon and is looking for a challenge without it being dangerous. If that just so happens to be you, then I think that these could very easily end up becoming the perfect Pokemon partner for you. Thank you all for listening, and please join me again next time when we cover the persistent pest of the ocean, Tentacool and its evolution, Tentacruel. Have a wonderful night, everyone.
I don't like the ocean. Oh, I'm fine with the beach. I love going to the beach with friends and family, but I don't go deeper in the ocean than when I can touch. Just thinking of how deep it is and how dark and cold it is, and the fact that anything could be around you and you wouldn't know it makes my skin crawl and my stomach turn over with fear. It's the reason that I'm not a fan of boats and will never ever get inside a submarine, even if my life depended on it. If it hadn't been for meeting Dan on the boat ride from Unova to Sinnoh, I probably would have spent the entire journey in my room just trying to ignore the fact that there could have been miles and miles of open water underneath me, with any number of known and unknown Pokemon looking up at the boat from the depth. Ugh. Anyway, this rant about my thalassophobia is brought to you by the subject of today's guide, Tentacool and its evolution, Tentacruel. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Pokemon Care Guides, where we go through how you would raise and care for different kinds of Pokemon in your own home. Today, we'll be talking about the cephalopod Pokemon Tentacool and its evolution, Tentacruel. For those of you that don't know what the word cephalopod means, it describes the type of body that these Pokemon have, meaning that they tend to just have a head with feet or limbs coming out of it. Which, I guess, technically means that Mankey and its like are cephalopods, which just feels weird. Anyway, Tentacool has a bulbous, light blue body that resembles a weird-shaped head. On top of this body are two large red protrusions that seem like eyes, but don't let that fool you. Its eyes are actually farther down near the bottom of its body, just above its beak-like mouth. Situated in the center of its forehead, I guess, is a small red gem that it can use to actually reflect light as a sort of warning system to predators. Hanging down from its body are two tentacles, both of which have a poisonous barb at the end that can deliver a very nasty amount of venom to those that get too close. If you were to measure this Pokemon from tip of tentacle to top of the head, you'd end up with something around 2 foot 9 inches. However, because most of this Pokemon's body is actually made of water, and water, when it gets all together, can be very heavy, this Pokemon tends to weigh around 100 pounds, which seems like a lot for a Pokemon that just floats around with the currents. However, once a Tentacool gets old enough, it'll evolve into a Tentacruel. At that point, it gets much taller, now being around the average height of 5 foot 3 inches. Funny enough, even though it's much bigger than Tentacool, its body isn't that much heavier, only averaging around 121 pounds. Tentacruel has a large light blue crest that covers the entirety of its body on the top, along with two large red protrusions and the red gem from when it was a Tentacool. However, the lower body has changed dramatically, now being a round black mass, where its eyes are situated. Its mouth is now at the bottom of its body, surrounded by two long, pincer-like jaws.
The Pokemon actually has about 80 tentacles to its body, but it only ever exposes 14 of them on a regular basis, the rest being held in reserve for when a tentacle is lost or for when they're trying to catch some really slippery prey. In all, they're the stuff of my ocean-based nightmares. But let's get into the guide and see if these Pokemon are the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. Okay, this is going to be complicated for multiple different reasons. The biggest among them being that both stages of this Pokemon's line need entirely different enclosure setups. One is a free-floating surface Pokemon that has very specific water requirements and care requirements, and the other resides on the bottom of the ocean and needs an enormous amount of space to even survive. It is an insane amount of work that goes into making sure that these guys are well taken care of. For example, let's look at the tank requirements to house these guys. Tentacool is going to need a very specific tank, one that's cylindrical. Since these Pokemon don't really swim so much as float, if you get a tank that has corners in it, they can end up being trapped there by the currents, which we'll mention in a moment. So you need a cylinder, one that's at least 8 feet in diameter and a minimum of 5 feet deep with at least another foot of head space above the water. Remember, these Pokemon tend to just float, so if you fill the water up to the brim, they'll just be banging and scraping along the roof of the tank. In all, the tanks are not too terribly big, but it's still going to be a struggle to fit inside your home unless you have a large room that you don't plan on doing much else with. Now, let's look at Tentacool, and this is where things can get ridiculous. Tentacool is a large, deep ocean-dwelling Pokemon, usually hanging out around rocky outcroppings along the ocean floor, meaning that they need a lot of room. I'll be honest, this tank is going to be thousands of gallons, something that a commercial aquarium would have. The tank needed for a Tentacool is going to be large enough that it could most likely fit your house in it. That's because these Pokemon no longer just float around, they actually swim and move around on their own power, so they need the room to do so. Especially since, like I said, these Pokemon tend to hang out around rocky outcrops, as they provide a good place for their nests and it provides protection from the predators that could be anywhere in the deep, dark water. Ugh, I hate that thought. But you will have to provide them with that rocky outcropping along the bottom of their tank, large enough that the Tentacool would be able to use it for cover from potential predators, even though there won't be any predators in its tank. So yeah, unless you have a ton of free space and a lot of disposable income, this tank might be a bit out of your reach. And that is just the tank size. There is plenty that you'll have to do with the water. The first of which I've already mentioned is the current. Tentacool and Tentacruel need a water current in their water, though they both need it for different reasons. Tentacool needs it as it's the only way for the Pokemon to realistically move around and catch its food. And Tentacruel, while they can move on their own now, they need the current to bring in fresh, oxygenated water. Without it, the Pokemon would actually suffocate. You don't want anything that's going to be like a riptide that's going to quickly drag your Pokemon around the tank, but a slow, moderate speed current would do these Pokemon well. And the best way that I've found to generate this current is to have a filter attached to the tank that can move the water without you really having to worry about it. The nice part about this is that the filter will also be able to keep the water clean, as thanks to the fact that these guys eat and produce waste in the tank, you'll need the filter to keep the water clean. Just be sure that you keep the filter cleaned out itself, as if you don't, the gunk can build up inside of it, impede the water flow, and lead to your Pokemon getting sick. And you'll probably need to get a new filter by the end of it. Which, a filter for a Tentacruel tank is pretty much a car engine, so it can be a bit much. Another thing that you're going to have to look at is the quality of the water itself. And I don't mean just one quality. I mean a lot of different qualities. You need to make sure that it's the right temp. Despite their name having the word cool in it, Tentacool tends to like the water a bit warmer, around 65 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit, as they get a lot of sunlight on the surface. Tentacool like it colder, between 50 to 65 degrees, as they don't get much sunlight further down in the water where they tend to live. Salinity will also be something they need to keep an eye on. Not only do you have to get a filter that can handle salt water, but you need to make sure that the salinity levels don't rise or lower to dangerous amounts. To that end, you should get into the habit of changing out about 10% of the water every week with new, fresh salt water. This will help keep the salinity levels regular, as well as help keep your water and tank clean. Other things that you should be keeping an eye on as well should be the pH, which should be kept between 8 and 8.3, the ammonia level kept at a 0, nitrites also kept at a 0, and nitrates kept below 20 parts per million. Now, I know that all seems like a lot, but there are saltwater test kits out there for this exact reason, and you can get them online or in certain stores fairly easily. You should also get something to help clean the inside of the tank, like one of those magnetic pads that you can rub a magnet along the outside of the tank, and the pad scrubs the inside as it follows along. Like I said, it's a lot to keep track of, and can be very overwhelming if you aren't prepared for it. And remember that all of that stuff I just mentioned isn't just for Tentacool, it also counts for Tentacruel's tanks as well. Though the sheer size of it means that you're going to be there for ages trying to clean and change out that water. The last thing that we need to cover has to be the Pokemon that can be housed with these Pokemon. Of course, you're going to have to look at other saltwater dwelling Pokemon, which in itself isn't that limiting. After all, there are tons of kinds of Pokemon that live in the oceans. No, what you're really going to have to look out for is finding something that won't prey on or be preyed on by the Tentacool evolution. After all, anything large enough might just decide to make a meal out of Tentacool since it's fairly easy to catch. Tentacruel might be a different story, but there are still some Pokemon out there that will try to take a bite out of it. And anything smaller than the Tentacool evolution will most likely be taken as prey. Especially since the venomous sting of Tentacool and Tentacruel are potent enough that anything that touches their tentacles really won't last that long. So you need something that is sturdy enough to survive the sting, not aggressive enough to take a bite out of your Pokemon, and not small enough to be taken as food. That's not very many Pokemon, honestly, though they do well with their own species. Especially Tentacruel, as they tend to gather together on the ocean floor in schools. So at least that's a nice benefit. Just remember that all enclosures that I describe in these guides are only rated for one Pokemon, and might need adjustment based on what else you have living in the tank with them. Though that might not be necessary with Tentacruel given just how big the enclosure needs to be for them. Availability. If you've been farther in the ocean than the shoreline, and even sometimes along the shore, then you've probably seen a Tentacool. Anywhere there's salt water, then that means that there's a good chance there's a Tentacool around there. In fact, the only regions that have managed to keep their seas relatively clear of these guys are the Unova and the Paldea regions. It's honestly incredible that these two regions don't have any populations of these guys. They're that numerous. And Tentacruel isn't that much rarer, it's just that you don't run into them as often as they spend most of their time down near the ocean floor, only coming up occasionally on their own, or when they get dragged up by some fishermen. So, if you want to find one of them, go to the same route you find Tentacool on. But you're gonna need a good deep-sea fishing rod to get one. And always keep in mind that you aren't guaranteed to get a Tentacruel on that line. You could pull up any number of deep-sea horrors. What fun! And going to the breeding scene, it's not that great for these guys. Thanks to the widespread availability of these Pokemon in the wild, and the amount of requirements keeping just one of these Pokemon has, there's not a lot of people out there that are willing to raise these Pokemon in breeding schools. After all, who's going to spend the money on getting a breeder-raised Tentacool when you can go to the beach and find 10 within an hour? And that's just Tentacool. Tentacool, honestly, I don't see a breeder taking that level of investment in a Pokemon species that many people aren't going to want or can still find out in the wild easier. So if you're like me and you don't like the ocean, it's going to be hard for you to find a breeder-raised Tentacool. Catchability. As long as you are prepared for these guys, catching one of them should not be too bad. I mean, yeah, if you go into the water looking for these guys without any plan on what to do if you get stung or a Pokemon that can battle them while you try to catch them, then yeah, they can be kind of dangerous and challenging. But just be sure to bring a grass or electric type Pokemon with you and plenty of antidotes for the toxic stings, and Tentacool should be a smooth catch. And in all honesty, you shouldn't need anything more expensive or powerful than a regular Pokeball. Tentacool follows the same general rules as Tentacool, but the Pokemon that you bring with you to defend you should probably be on the stronger side, as Tentacool can be fairly tough from what I understand. And because of that extra toughness, I would also recommend that you get a few of the stronger Pokeballs. Great Balls should work fine, but you can get Ultra Balls if you really want to. It won't be too hard of a catch, but it will put up a bit of a fight, especially if you aren't ready for them. Care. Most of the care for these Pokemon is going to be tank care, like we talked about in the enclosure section. Just to quickly rehash the tank care, change out 10% of the water every week, use a test to check the salinity and pH levels, and be sure to have a consistent current moving through the water. And that really is it. After all, with how venomous these Pokemon are, you're not really going to be interacting with them, so no sticking your hands in the Tentacool's tank or diving into Tentacool's tank if you manage to get one of those. Though, that does bring me to something I wanted to mention. Always have a spare antidote around if you have one of these Pokemon. It's a good rule for any poison-type Pokemon, and these guys are no exception. You might never need it, but it's always better to be prepared for something and never need it than to need something and never have it. Store it somewhere close by to the tank, and just be sure to keep an eye on it so it doesn't go bad on you just in case you do need it. Another thing that I want to tell you about is their tentacles. As I'm sure you can tell just by looking at them, they aren't that strong. And so, they do have a tendency to snap off a Pokemon. If that happens, don't freak out, it's not that big a deal. Tentacool's tentacles will regrow if given enough food and time. And Tentacool actually has 80 tentacles, but only ever has about 14 or so extended from its body at any given time. So, unless your Pokemon are getting really beat up, your Tentacool shouldn't run out of tentacles in its lifetime. The best thing for you to do is to get the Tentacool out of the water as soon as you can, as it will start to rot and can cause health problems for your Pokemon. Now, speaking of things just being left in the tank to rot, let's talk about food. The unfortunate part of this is going to be that they need live food. They won't feed on something that's already dead, meaning that you're going to need to stock their tank with prey. After all, I mentioned this in the enclosure section of this guide that any smaller fish that you put in the tank with them will end up becoming food. And while that's good advice on not keeping other Pokemon that you don't want eaten in the tank, you will need to put something in there for them to feed on. The obvious answers to that are either Magikarp or Feebas, as they're certainly not a threat to your Tentacool evolution. Though, Feebas might be a bit hard to get a hold of as they are much rarer than Magikarp. Other more unconventional options would be Luvdisc or Finneon, which are better to look at than the first two options, but do remember that these are going to be the prey for your jellyfish Pokemon, so they won't be around that long and you will have to watch them get eaten. Now, the best part about Tentacool is that their bodies are actually quite see-through thanks to the majority of their biology being made of water. That means that when they eat, you should be able to see their stomachs and how much they have left to eat. Roughly, your Tentacool should be fed once a day until their stomach is full, as they are slow digesters, and it's not like they need the energy to move around. So if you give them one prey item and you notice that they still have some room in their stomachs for more, then just give them another one. You want to make sure that their stomach is full after that first feeding. Same with Tentacool, though that can be a bit harder. One reason is that Tentacool uses a lot more energy than its pre-evolution does, so you're going to have to feed it more often. On top of that, its tank can be so large that it can be kind of hard to see whether its stomach is full, the way you can with Tentacool. So the method of keeping an eye on it and feeding it till it's full kinda doesn't work with Tentacool. Instead, you're going to want to feed it about 30% of its weight in food. That does unfortunately mean that you'll have to feed the average Tentacool about 36 pounds of food a day, but then again, Magikarp tend to weigh around 22 pounds. Combine that with a Feebas, which weighs around 16 pounds, and that should be near the correct amount. It doesn't have to be that combination of feeder species, obviously, but you can see how feeding these guys is actually not too hard. The only issue is going to be keeping the feeders. You'll either need to consistently, every day, get more food for these guys, or you're going to have to set up an enclosure where you can keep the feeder Pokemon for later in the week. Which those guides will be up when we get to them. However, be sure to keep an eye on the tank water especially well after you feed your Pokemon. They are animals, and therefore they're not the neatest eaters in the world. After eating their prey, things like bones and flesh flakes will be left just floating in the water. In the wild, this would either sink to the ocean floor or be carried away on the current. But in your tank, this can end up just floating in the water. And like I said with the Tentacool situation, it'll start to rot after some time and cause the water to become gross and a great breeding site for bacteria. So you're going to want to keep an eye on how gross and full of food flakes your Pokemon's tank gets. Luckily, your filter should be able to take care of that. But after a few days, don't forget to open up your filter and clean it out. If you let the gross food bits build up too much inside of it, then it could stop pumping it back into the enclosure, or your filter could end up breaking and you'll have to replace it. I know cleaning out the grossness isn't fun, but it's probably better than having to replace the filter constantly. Cost. The enclosures are going to be a good hit to your wallet. Even if you build it yourself, you are looking at a lot of glass parts that need to be custom made, along with all the small bits that you'll need to keep the enclosure running. Things like the filter, the salinity test, all the water that you're going to need to use, and filling it and keeping it clean, it's gonna push Tentacool's enclosure anywhere from the top of the high category to the beginning of the very high category. And Tentacool? That's going to be so far in the very high category, it's probably got 6 figures attached to it. The food is going to be costly as well. I can't give you a price if you raise and keep the feeders yourselves, as I haven't done any of the guides on them yet, but I can tell you that buying the live fish every day will run you into the very high category per month. The local fish breeders will love you for it though. Honestly, you probably won't have to spend too much on the Pokemon, and that's probably because you're going to catch it yourself. After all, they're so abundant in so many places around the world that even getting a wild-caught Tentacool would be cheaper than getting a breeder-raised one. And that leaves these Pokemon in the very low or the low category, depending on what kind of Pokeball you use and how many you end up using. A breeder-raised one will probably run you around the high category though, for those of you that really want to get one that way. Conclusion. I stand by what I said. I don't like the ocean, and after this guide, I don't think I like these Pokemon. For different reasons, of course. The ocean is a yawning chasm of never-ending horrors that could swallow me as soon as I set foot in the water, but the reason that I don't like the Tentacool line is that they require a lot from someone to care for them, like their water specifications, tank shape, and especially Tentacool's enclosure size, which is massive. But then again, I'm not a fan of most ocean-dwelling Pokemon for the same reasons. No average person is going to be able to keep either of the Whalmer line or a Sharpedo or any of the other Pokemon that thrive in that deep, dark abyss. These are very much Pokemon that are for commercial aquariums or for people that have a lot of money and a lot of space. And if that happens to be you, then these could very well be the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Thank you all for listening in, and please join us again next time when we go over the rock Pokemon Geodude and the evolutions Graveler and Golem. Have a wonderful night, everyone.
I was thinking about it as I was doing the research for this guide, and I realized something that just felt weird. This is going to be the first guide where we cover a rock-type Pokemon. Sure, we've done ground-type Pokemon before, they're very similar, but we've covered fairy and psychic types in this series before, and there have been multiple water and grass types. I don't know, I guess it just always felt to me that rock types are just as abundant as the other elemental types, but I guess at least in the Kanto Pokedex that's turning out to not be true in the beginning. But we're going to fix that issue today. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Pokemon Care Guides, where we go through how you would raise and care for different Pokemon lines in your own home. Today, we'll be talking about the stone-bodied Pokemon of the Geodude line. Geodude itself is a rather small Pokemon, being only 1 foot 4 inches tall and weighing about 44 pounds. Its body plan is also very simple. Its main body is a rounded boulder, where its large mouth and wide eyes are, with 2 muscular arms coming out of either side. Its body is also made of a craggy grayish stone, although older Geodudes do tend to smooth themselves out. Overall, it's a very simple body plan. When they evolve into a Graveler, they do get a decent size bigger, now averaging around 3 foot 3 inches tall and shooting way up in height, averaging around 231 pounds. They have the same stony, boulder-like body as Geodude, though its large middle sphere is so large that it actually looks like a whole body as opposed to just a head. Graveler also now has 4 arms instead of Geodude's 2, a new set of feet, and a stony crest above its eyes. Usually in the wild, this is where the evolution line ends, but if you manage to get a Graveler through a trade with another trainer, then it'll evolve one last time into a Golem. Golem actually takes a departure from the rest of the line in that its body doesn't look like it's made out of pure rock. Instead, it has a large round shell that covers nearly its entire body, with only its legs, arms, and face sticking out. The shell looks almost like stone blocks that have been slotted together to make it. Its legs and arms are very short and stubby, with sharp claws on the end of the toes and fingers, and the face is almost reptilian in nature, sticking out of the middle of the front of the shell. Accompanying this change in body plan is a massive increase in size, now standing 4 foot 7 inches tall and weighing a whopping 661 pounds, making Golem the heaviest Pokemon that we've talked about in this series so far. In all, these Pokemon hold new challenges that we haven't seen yet in this series, so let's get into it and find out if these big rocky boys are the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. A lot of people like to diss on rock-type Pokemon due to their many weaknesses, like steel, grass, and water, and for the fact that many people see rock types as just boring Pokemon. But the nice thing about that simplicity is that it often means that they have easy enclosures to raise them in, like with the Geodude line. In the wild, you often find these guys on rocky trails, or on the side of mountains, or in caves. And while that is their preferred environment, it doesn't mean that you need to live on the side of a mountain for them to be comfortable or happy. Really, these Pokemon could live anywhere as long as their environment contains a few specific elements. One of which being a home where they can escape the elements. After all, being weak to water type attacks, they really aren't a fan of rain or snow. So they need a place that they can go to that they don't have to worry about any storms that are coming through. But, contrary to what anyone who listens to this series might expect, I'm not going to recommend repurposing a shed to make their home. Mostly because these Pokemon do very well when they have a solid connection to the ground. Both Geodude and Graveler like to bury themselves in the ground somewhat when they sleep. And when Golem sheds its shell, the old shell will then crumble and turn to dirt. If you provide them with a shed, then the floor of the shed will just be getting in the way. Plus, the fact that I usually mention the shed as a way to protect your Pokemon from the temperatures outside, as you can regulate how cold or hot it gets inside of the shed using different methods. But, being mainly rock types and living on the slopes of mountains, these Pokemon handle both the cold and the heat much better than most other Pokemon. So instead of the shed, I would recommend that you provide them with a sort of awning or pagoda, something that'll keep a certain spot of the enclosure dry, but is still sturdy enough that the Pokemon could bump into it and it won't be too affected by it. After all, Graveler and Golem prefer to roll everywhere, and they aren't the most graceful Pokemon when they do that. Just be sure to get something that'll cover an area of space large enough for your Pokemon to still move around a bit. So, at least 15 feet by 15 feet. If you really wanted to, you could even hang some mesh curtains along the sides to help prevent the weather from making it under the awning, but do keep in mind that isn't necessary and it may get in your Pokemon's way. As for the rest of the enclosure, it really doesn't have to be anything special. A simple grass yard would do fine for these guys, just so long as you keep the vegetation low. This line tends to be found along mountain trails and in cave systems, so they don't like to have tall grass or too many trees in their home. But so long as you keep your grass cut short, your yard should do fine for these guys. As for the sizes, Geodude is going to need the least amount of space. Not only because they're the smallest of the line, but also because they're the least mobile of the trio. Geodude tend to only move when they're in search of food, and since they eat minerals and rocks, it's not that long of a hunt. When they aren't looking for food, they tend to partly bury themselves in the ground and remain perfectly still. That's why you so often hear of people that went mountain hiking and stepped on a Geodude by accident. It's because they blend in with the environment so well. For a Geodude, I would say the best size is a yard that's at least 25 by 25 feet. That way they have the room to move if they want to, and the decor won't get much in their way, which we'll get into in a moment. When it comes to Graveler and Golem, they will need much more space, thanks to the fact that they're just much more mobile than Geodude. Thanks to the relatively stubby legs compared to the rest of their body, they've developed a tendency to roll when they want to move anywhere farther than like 10 feet. So that means that they need an enclosure that is large enough for them to actually roll around. Thankfully, there isn't a massive difference in size when you compare the two of them, so Graveler and Golem can have the same size enclosure. You're going to be looking at something that's 75 feet by 75 feet, large enough that they will have plenty of room to roll without it being unmanageable. One thing that you will have to do though is that you will have to use some pretty sturdy fencing to make the walls of your enclosure. After all, if your 200-pound Graveler or your 600-pound Golem slams into it after picking up some speed while rolling, you want to make sure they don't just smash through whatever you have keeping them in. A few solutions to this are making a fence with concrete pillars that go deep into the ground so that when they hit them, they won't be ripped out of the ground. Another possible solution could also be to get massive stone blocks that can be stacked like building blocks along the edge of your property. These things are sturdy enough and heavy enough that they should be able to take a direct hit from your Pokemon, even if they built up a ton of speed. These are just a few options that you can use, and there are a bunch more out there for those of you that don't like the two options I've given. Just keep in mind, you will need something to keep your Pokemon in. Another thing that I'm going to mention here is the decorations.
As I've mentioned before, these Pokemon live on the side of mountains, usually along mountain trails. So for them to be the most comfortable, you should have rocks of different sizes scattered throughout the enclosure. They can be of all different kinds of sizes, so long as they aren't so big as to take up a large part of the enclosure, and they're spread out enough to not impede your Pokemon from moving around easily. Also, you should keep an eye on these rocks, as you may have to replace them if your Pokemon gets hungry and decides to nibble on one as a snack. Yes, these Pokemon eat rocks, but we'll cover that when we get to the care section. Just know that they might occasionally take a bite out of the decorative rocks. The same actually goes for if you use the stones to make the border around your enclosure, now that I think about it. Just keep an eye on these as well if you end up going with that path. You don't want your Pokemon to eat their way out of their enclosure. The last part of the enclosure section is going to be what can be housed with them. There are a few types to avoid with these guys, those being water and grass types. Not because these guys are unfriendly, but because if these Pokemon get annoyed with your Geodude evolution, they can end up doing some serious damage to it. As well, fighting types should also be avoided. Like we mentioned in the Machop care guide, fighting types will often use heavy rocks to work out with, and trying to do that with your Geodude evolution will just irritate the Pokemon, which could lead to fights that probably won't end well for your rock type. Aside from that, you should also make sure that any Pokemon that you put in with a Graveler or a Golem is either fast enough to get out of their way, or sturdy enough that getting hit by them won't be a problem. After all, like I said, they aren't exactly graceful when they roll, and in the wild they'll often just bounce off rocks and trees in their environment until they come to a stop. So anything too slow or too squishy probably won't end well with these guys. Other rock types, plenty of steel types, non-aggressive fire types, normal types, possibly even the less territorial flying types would all be good choices to house with these guys. They also do very well with their own kind, often being found in groups out in the wild as opposed to solitary members. Though, do be aware that these Pokemon, especially Geodude, like to test their strength and hardiness against one another by bashing themselves together. This can lead to pieces being chipped off their bodies. We'll cover this better in the care section, but I wanted to say here that if that happens, don't be alarmed. Your Pokemon are perfectly fine. It's just something that will happen if you have multiples of this Pokemon in an enclosed space. And always remember that I only ever give you the specifications for only one Pokemon per enclosure. If you do plan on adding in more, be sure to expand the enclosure accordingly to the new Pokemon's needs. Availability. When talking about the first two evolutions, they're highly available in the wild. Geodude is so numerous wherever there are mountains and caves that there's a native population in almost every region. The only two without a native Geodude population are Galar and mainland Paldea, and even then, the Kitakami region is well known to have them. But places like Mount Moon, Coronet Mountain, Mount Silver, most Victory Roads, and all the routes surrounding these mountains are well known to have Geodude and Graveler populations. Even my home of Unova, which is notorious for trying to keep Pokemon native to other regions out of its environments, has a native population of these Pokemon in Challenger's Cave. So my point is that if you want to find these Pokemon, then you probably don't have to travel too far to find them. I should mention to those of you that live in Alola, you won't be able to find the version of Geodude that we're talking about in this guide. Instead, you'll find the Alolan version of this line, which has adapted to have the electric type. We'll talk about that specific line when we get to the Alola Pokemon in the future. Back to the Cantonian line, the only one that you won't find in the wild is Golem. Thanks to their ground type, Graveler almost never experience the needed electrical shock to stimulate their systems to evolve outside of a trading machine, leading to the near non-existence of wild Golem. Which brings us to breeders. Thanks to the prevalence of the first two evolutions, these Pokemon aren't as popular to have in the breeding industry.
But thanks to the fact that they're relatively easy to raise in large numbers, and the fact that going out to catch one of the later evolutions can be somewhat risky, there are people out there that do raise them. It's not going to be like trying to find a Tentacool breeder, and if you're looking for a sure way to get a golem, then this is the best method in my opinion. So if you don't live near where these Pokemon live, and you don't want to or can't travel to go get a wild one, then you might just have to do a little bit of digging to find someone that raises these Pokemon. Catchability. Geodude is going to be the easiest to catch out of the 3 evolutions. After all, they do congregate along mountain trails, so all you really need to do is go hiking for a day and you should find one. I would recommend bringing a water or grass type Pokemon with you to protect you, as they can get a bit grouchy, especially if you find them by accident by stepping on them, which is often how these encounters start. The nice part is that they aren't the strongest Pokemon on the mountain, so a Pokeball should be plenty strong enough to catch them. Graveler and Golem, if you're lucky enough to find one in the wild, are very similar when it comes to catching them. Hunting them down will be riskier than with Geodude, as they don't frequent the hiking trails and instead scale the mountainside itself, meaning that to find them, you'll often have to go off trail, which can be dangerous if you aren't prepared for it. So really, be sure that you are fit enough to handle going over rough, uneven terrain. You'll also need to keep your head on a swivel and listen for the sound of these Pokemon rolling down the mountainside at high speeds. These Pokemon have been clocked at speeds upwards of 60 miles per hour, and I don't have to tell you what it'll mean if a 200 or 600 pound rock hits you at that speed. Even if you manage to find one that isn't rolling, these Pokemon have a worrying tendency to explode if they feel they are in enough danger. Bring a strong water or grass type with you, with your best option being a water type with the damp ability, as that would prevent them from blowing up on you altogether. If you manage to get to the point where you can catch them, the best thing to use would be something near the strength of a Great Ball for Graveler, and absolutely bring an Ultra Ball for Golem. You will need the extra power they bring. Please, if you decide to go after one of the later evolutions, be careful. They can be very dangerous. Care. Alright, let's address the exploding thing first before we get into anything else. As I just said, the later evolutions have a tendency to use the moves Self-Destruct and Explosion if they feel threatened enough. Now, contrary to the rumor out there, these moves don't actually cause the Pokemon to blow itself to smithereens. They do, however, cause an explosion that deals just as much damage to the Pokemon that use the move as it does to whatever they use the move on. And, of course, you don't want your Pokemon to do that, meaning you need to make sure that the Pokemon feels safe around you and in its enclosure. To that end, you should spend some time every day building your trust with the Pokemon. This will be easier with a breeder-raised Pokemon as opposed to a wild-caught one, but since we're working with the later evolutions, they're thankfully much less competitive than Geodude. So, to build trust with this Pokemon, there are a few things that you can do. One is, of course, feeding them. These Pokemon feed on different minerals that are often found in the rocks of the mountain ranges that they live in. This can range from the common quartz crystal to small deposits of salt to the more rare ones such as malachite. They use these minerals to not only fuel their stone bodies, but also heal and regrow the parts that end up breaking off. Meaning, yes, you will be feeding these Pokemon rocks. That's why I mentioned earlier that they may start to nibble on the stones that you place throughout their enclosure. But you can't just feed them any rocks you find lying on the side of the road. One, the chemicals and oils that are found on blacktop isn't good for them. And two, they need a very specific mixture of minerals to allow them to function and remain healthy. Missing any of them could mean that your Pokemon starts to have health problems. Thankfully, there are plenty of diets that have been developed designed to accommodate many different species of rock-eating Pokemon. The majority of the Geodude line's diet, around 60% or so, is going to consist of silica, which is the main component in the majority of rocks that you'll find, but
differs based on what kind of rock you use. Then the remaining should be 25% quartz, 10% salt, and the remaining 5% should be made of a mixture of other common minerals. You can also mix in rarer minerals if you like, but treat them more as treats as opposed to common food. Too much of them could lead to health problems for your Pokemon. As for how often to feed them, these Pokemon are more grazers than anything, feeding on small amounts as they go throughout their day. So the best bet is to leave them out for them to munch on as they go through their day. Just spread them throughout the enclosure and your Pokemon should munch on them when they want to. I mean, they're rocks, so it's not like they're going to be going bad, so there's no harm in putting them out early in the morning and just leaving them there all day. Amount-wise, you're looking at a consistently escalating amount of stone that you're going to be needing. A good rule of thumb that I've seen online for these guys is that they should eat an average of 5% of their body weight a day, meaning Geodude will need around 2 pounds of food, Graveler will need about 11 or 12 pounds of food, and Golem will require a massive 33 pounds a day of food. Even if the food is just rocks, that can be a massive amount of food to sustain. Back to the original point, through you providing this food every day, they will slowly start to associate you with that positive stimuli, leading to them becoming much more relaxed and comfortable around you. The second way to make sure your Pokemon is more comfortable around you is through washing and cleaning them. When they roll around, or through Geodude burying itself when it sleeps, your Pokemon will inevitably become dirty. This dirt can wedge itself into the cracks and nooks of the Pokemon's stone body, and while it won't affect their health too much, after all they are ground types, it can affect their movement, their senses, and even cause chafing if it's in the wrong spot. To that end, every few weeks or so, you will have to clean them and get the dirt out of the nooks and crannies on their body. Now, with the reversion to water, you aren't just going to hose them down. Instead, you're going to need to get a long-handled, thin brush that's designed for this kind of thing. Or a toothbrush if you're in a pinch. Wet the brush slightly, not to the point where it's soaked, but just enough to activate the soap that you're going to put on the brush next. Be sure to get a soap that's non-corrosive and Pokemon friendly. And then you're going to take the brush and slowly use it to scrub, scrape, and brush the dirt off its body. The soap should suds up slightly as you're working, helping to dissolve the more stubborn stuff that gets stuck in there. Then, after you get the dirt out of wherever it was, take a dry, clean cloth and wipe the soap suds off your Pokemon. Don't use water to get it off. Your Pokemon will hate it and will make this harder to do in the future. So long as you use only a little bit of water and reward your Pokemon for going along with the behavior, this should prove to be another way for you to bond with and build trust between you and your Pokemon. Plus, as a nice bonus, it will help keep your Pokemon healthier over the long run. The last thing that I want to talk about is your Pokemon's body. More specifically, the tendency for the Pokemon of this line to leave body parts laying behind. Now, that sounds worse than it is, but it's still something that can freak people out if you have one of these Pokemon and it happens unexpectedly. This is most pronounced with Graveler. Thanks to its tendency to roll everywhere at high speeds and the lack of Golem's protective shell, when Graveler slams into a hard object, it can sometimes break off bits of its body. This can be as minor as some stone chipping off the body somewhere, to something as major as losing an arm. Luckily, Graveler also has the ability to regenerate any body parts that it loses, so even if it does lose an arm, it will eventually be able to grow it back with plenty of supervision and plenty of food. Geodude also does this, but to them it's more of a territorial show of strength kind of thing. So if you're keeping multiple Geodude together, or even keeping other rock-type Pokemon with them like Carbink or Rock'n'Rolla, they will slap themselves off each other, trying to see who's stronger. This can lead to chips being taken off of your Geodude, and if they consistently lose the contest of strength, it can lead to your Pokemon becoming slightly smaller and more spherical over time. This isn't a terrible thing, as the more that gets chipped off, the more tempered their attitude gets, but do keep an eye out, as Geodude does not regenerate like Graveler does. Golem is the one that you really have to worry about the least. As they age and grow, they will shed their shells while growing a new one. This is the one you have to worry about the least because they'll have grown a new shell underneath the old one by the time they shed it. In fact, you don't even have to get rid of the old shell, as it'll quickly crumble into a dirt pile that you'll just have to kick around to flatten out. The only thing to keep an eye on is that once your golem reaches a certain age where they stop growing, they will stop shedding their shell. So don't freak out if suddenly your golem hasn't shed in a while. Also, the dirt that comes from the old shell is great for plant growth. So if you can find a farmer, you might be able to sell it to them. Or you could use it to grow your lawn. Up to you. Cost. The enclosure will be in the high category, so long as you already have the space for it. Really, where most of the cost is going to be coming from here is the walls. No matter what kind of barrier you decide to go with, it'll probably cost you a decent penny to get it. Aside from that, the gazebo awning thing and the decoration rocks will add on a little bit of cost, but not much. As for the Pokemon, the price can vary. The price will change based on which one you're going after. Geodude should be in the very low or the low category, mostly because you'll probably go out and catch it yourself, meaning it's really a matter of how many Pokeballs you use on it. Graveler and Golem, though, I would say that it would be better and safer for you to get one from a breeder, mainly to get a head start on the not exploding thing. Graveler, thankfully, will be in the moderate category, but Golem will probably jump you up into the low end of the high category. The food won't be more than the moderate category. Sure, it's going to be a lot for the later evolutions, but come on, it's rocks. If you go to a quarry and explain to them what you're looking for, then they should be able to give you enough to feed your Pokemon for a while. And always remember that buying in bulk or large amounts can often save you money in the long run. Conclusion. I really wasn't expecting a lot from these Pokemon. Like I said, they're so common near mountains and caves that you really don't think of them that much. Mostly they're just something to keep an eye out for as you walk mountain trails. But as I did this research, I really grew to like these guys. I mean, they're great beginner Pokemon. Sturdy, simple, and I mean, they eat rocks, so you don't have to deal with raw meat or live prey. The only issue that I can see with them is the exploding thing. But they're often so laid back that unless you're actively attacking them, it's not that big a danger. It's still something to look out for, and the latter two evolutions are rather big for younger owners, but if you're looking for a Pokemon line that's sturdy and easy to care for, then these could easily be the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Thank you all for listening, and please join us again next time when we talk about the fiery equine Pokemon Ponyta and Rapidash. Have a wonderful night, everyone.